It is great to be back in Kenya. Thank you so much for this extraordinary welcome. I know it took a few years, but as president, I try to keep my promises. And I said I was going to come, and I'm here. So, and everybody, go ahead and have a seat. I'm going to be talking for a while. Relax. I want to thank my sister Alma for a wonderful introduction. I'm so glad that she could be with us here today, and it was, as she said, it was Alma who first guided me through Kenya almost 30 years ago. To President Kenyatta, I want to thank you once again for the hospitality that you've shown me, for our work together on this visit, and for being here today. It's a great honor. I am proud to be the first American president to come to Kenya. And of course, I'm the first Kenyan American to be president of the United States. That goes without saying. I love you back. I do. But as Alma was saying, the first time I came to Kenya, things were a little different. When I arrived at Kenyatta Airport, the airline had lost my bags. That doesn't happen on Air Force One. They always have my luggage on Air Force One. As she said, Alma picked me up in an old Volkswagen Beetle. And I think the entire stay I was here, it broke down 4 or 5 times. We'd be on the highway, we'd have to call the Joakali. He'd bring his tools. We'd be sitting there waiting. And I slept on a cot in her apartment. Instead of eating at fancy banquets with the president, we were drinking tea and eating ugali, and sukuma wiki, and so there wasn't a lot of luxury. Sometimes the lights would go out. They still do, is that what someone said? But you know, there was something more important than luxury on that first trip. And that was a sense of being recognized, being seen. I was a young man, and I was just a few years out of university. I'd worked as a community organizer in low-income neighborhoods in Chicago. I was about to go to law school, and when I came here, you know, in many ways I was a Westerner. I was an American, unfamiliar with my father and his birthplace, really disconnected from half of my heritage. And at that airport, as I was trying to find my luggage, there was a woman there who worked for the airlines, and she was helping fill out the forms, and she saw my name, and she looked up and she asked if I was related to my father, who she had known. And that was the first time that my name meant something, right? And that it was recognized. And over the course of several weeks, I'd meet my brothers, aunts, and uncles. I'd travel to Alego, the village where my family was from. I saw the graves of my father and my grandfather. And I learned things about their lives that I could have never learned through books. And in many ways, their lives offered snapshots of Kenya's history. But they also told us something about the future. My grandfather, for example, he was a cook for the British. And as I went through some of his belongings when I went up country, I found the passbook he had had to carry as a domestic servant. It listed his age and his height, his tribe, listed the number of teeth he had missing. And he was referred to as a boy, even though he was a grown man in that passbook. And he was in the King's African Rifles during the Second World War and was taken to the far reaches of the British Empire, all the way to Burma. And back home, after the war, he was eventually detained for a time because he was linked to a group that opposed British rule. And eventually he was released. He forged a home for himself and his family. He earned the respect of his village, lived a life of dignity, although he had a well-earned reputation for being so strict that everybody was scared of him. And he became estranged from part of his family. So that was his story. And then my father came of age as Kenyans were pursuing independence. And he was proud to be a part of that liberation generation. And next to my grandfather's papers, I found letters that he had written to 30 American universities asking for a chance to pursue his dream and get a scholarship. And ultimately, one university gave him that chance, the University of Hawaii. And he would go on to get an education and then return home. And here, at first, he found success as an economist and worked with the government, but ultimately he found disappointment in part because he couldn't reconcile the ideas that he had for his young country with the hard realities that had confronted him. And I think sometimes about what these stories tell us, what the history and the past tell us about the future. And they show us the enormous barriers to progress that so many Kenyans faced just 1 or 2 generations ago. This is a young country. We were talking last night at dinner. The president's father was the first president. We're only a generation removed. And the daily limitations and sometimes humiliations of colonialism, that's recent history. The corruption and cronyism and tribalism that sometimes confront young nations, that's recent history. But what these stories also tell us is an arc of progress. From foreign rule to independence, from isolation to education and engagement with a wider world. It speaks of incredible progress. So we have to know the history of Kenya, just as we Americans have to know our American history. All people have to understand where they come from. But we also have to remember why these lessons are important. We know our history so that we can learn from it. We learn our history because we understand the sacrifices that were made before, so that when we make sacrifices, we understand we're doing it on behalf of future generations. There's a proverb that says, "We have not inherited this land from our forebears, we have borrowed it from our children." In other words, we study the past so it can guide us into the future and inspire us to do better. And when it comes to the people of Kenya, particularly the youth, I believe there is no limit to what you can achieve. A young, ambitious Kenyan today should not have to do what my grandfather did and serve a foreign master. You don't need to do what my father did and leave your home in order to get a good education and access to opportunity. Because of Kenya's progress, because of your potential, you can build your future right here, right now. Now, like any country, Kenya is far from perfect, but it has come so far in just my lifetime. After a bitter struggle, Kenyans claimed their independence just a few years after I was born, and after decades of one-party rule, Kenya embraced a multi-party system in the 1990s, just as I was beginning my own political career in the United States. Tragically, just under a decade ago, Kenya was nearly torn apart by violence at the same time that I was running for my first campaign for president. And I remember hearing the reports of thousands of innocent people being killed or driven from their homes. And from a distance, it seemed like the Kenya that I knew, a Kenya that was able to reach beyond ethnic and tribal lines, that it might split apart across those lines of tribe and ethnicity. But look what happened. The people of Kenya chose not to be defined by the hatreds of the past. You chose a better history. The voices of ordinary people and political leaders and civil society did not eliminate all these divisions, but you addressed the divisions and differences peacefully. And a new constitution was put in place declaring that every person has inherent dignity and the right to have that dignity respected and protected. A competitive election went forward, not without problems, but without the violence that so many had feared. In other words, Kenyans chose to stay together. You chose the path of Harambee. And in part because of this political stability, Kenya's economy is also emerging. And the entrepreneurial spirit that people rely on to survive in the streets of Kibera can now be seen in new businesses across the country, from the city square to the smallest villages. M-Pesa is changing the way people use money. New investment is making Kenya a hub for regional trade. When I came here as a U.S. Senator, I pointed out that South Korea's economy was the same as Kenya's when I was born, and then was 40 times larger than Kenya's. Think about that. Started at the same place. South Korea had gone here and Kenya was here. But today that gap has been cut in half, just in the last decade, which means Kenya is making progress. And meanwhile, Kenya continues to carve out a distinct place in the community of nations as a source of peacekeepers for places torn apart by conflict, a host for refugees driven from their homes, a leader for conservation, following the footprints of Wangari Maathai. Kenya is one of the places on this continent that truly observes freedom of the press, and their fearless journalists and courageous civil society members. And in the United States, we see the legacy of Kip Keino every time a Kenyan wins one of our marathons. And maybe the First Lady of Kenya is going to win one soon. I told the President he has to start running with his wife. We want him to stay fit. So there's much to be proud of, much progress to lift up. It's a good news story. But we also know the progress is not complete. There are still problems that shadow ordinary Kenyans every day. Challenges that can deny you your livelihood and sometimes deny you lives. As in America and so many countries around the globe, economic growth has not always been broadly shared. Sometimes people at the top do very well, but ordinary people still struggle. Today, a young child in Nyanza province is 4 times more likely to die than a child in Central province, even though they are equal in dignity in the eyes of God. That's a gap that has to be closed. A girl in Rift Valley is far less likely to attend secondary school than a girl in Nairobi. That's a gap that has to be closed. Across the country, one study shows corruption costs Kenyans 250,000 jobs every year, because every shilling that's paid as a bribe could be put into the pocket of somebody who's actually doing an honest day's work. And despite the hard-earned political progress that I spoke of, those political gains still have to be protected. New laws and restrictions could close off the space where civil society gives individual citizens a voice and holds leaders accountable. Old tribal divisions and ethnic divisions can still be stirred up. I want to be very clear here. A politics that's based solely on tribe and ethnicity is a politics that's doomed to tear a country apart. It is a failure of imagination. Of course, here in Kenya, we also know the specter of terrorism has touched far too many lives. And we remember the Americans and Kenyans who died side by side in the attack on our embassy in the 90s. We remember the innocent Kenyans who were taken from us at Westgate Mall. We weep for the nearly 150 people slaughtered at Garissa, including so many students who had such a bright future before them. We honor the memory of so many other innocent Kenyans whose lives have been lost in this struggle. So Kenya is at a crossroads, a moment filled with peril, but also enormous promise. And with the rest of my time here today, I'd like to talk about how you can seize the moment, how you can make sure we leave behind a world that's better, a world that we've borrowed from our children. When I first came to Sub-Saharan Africa as president, I made clear my strong belief that the future of Africa is up to Africans. For too long, I think that many looked to the outside for salvation and focused on somebody else being at fault for the problems of the continent. And as my sister said, ultimately, we are each responsible for our own destiny. And I'm here as president of a country that sees Kenya as an important partner. I'm here as a friend who wants Kenya to succeed. And the pillars of that success are clear: strong democratic governance, development that provides opportunity for all people and not just some, a sense of national identity that rejects conflict for a future of peace and reconciliation. And today we can see that future for Kenya on the horizon, but tough choices are going to have to be made in order to arrive at that destination. In the United States, I always say that what makes America exceptional is not the fact that we're perfect. It's the fact that we struggle to improve. We're self-critical. We work to live up to our highest values and ideals, knowing that we're not always going to achieve them perfectly, but we keep on trying to perfect our union. And what's true for America is also true for Kenya. You can't be complacent and accept the world just as it is. You have to imagine what the world might be and then push and work towards that future. Progress requires that you honestly confront the dark corners of our own past, extend rights and opportunities to more of your citizens, see the differences and diversity of this country as a strength, just as we in America try to see the diversity of our country as a strength and not a weakness. So you can choose the path to progress, but it requires making some important choices. First and foremost, it means continuing down the path of a strong, more inclusive, more accountable, and transparent democracy. You know, democracy begins with a peacefully elected government. It begins with elections, but it doesn't stop with elections. So your Constitution offers a roadmap to governance that's more responsive to the people through protections against unchecked power, more power in the hands of local communities. For this system to succeed, there also has to be space for citizens to exercise their rights. And we saw the strength of Kenya's civil society in the last election when groups collected reports of incitement so that violence could be stopped before it spun out of control. And the ability of citizens to organize and advocate for change. That's the oxygen upon which democracy depends.